Welcome everyone to this week's video. Today we are on Fish Friday number 221 and we have a good one for you today. I did actually have a fish video recorded in preparation. Obviously I'm in a hotel room this week. I am once again out in the field doing my new job. You can see my suitcase over there. It's a whole mess, but you know, it's still good to be out in the field. But I did have a video recorded. Obviously, I'm going to have to go back and record over that video, at least a part of it, because I ran into a landowner today and we had a long talk, and what I felt was an important talk. And the landowner had some misconceptions that I realized many people probably have, and I wanted to give a quick educational background on. So the title, this video is going to be about United States wildlife law, because there is a lot of misconceptions about the law and what is actually goes on with the wildlife and regulations and things like that. And it's a common misconception. So this is more of an educational video, but I felt it was very important for at least the people who enjoy that sort of thing, as a little bit of a history lesson. So let's kind of start at the beginning of the United States. And we're actually going to go a little bit before that, back when United States of America did not have any colonialism, and we still lived in England. So in England and in most other countries in the world, wildlife is actually treated as part of the land itself. So in England, there's been some changes, but back in the colonial and the noble and serf times, wildlife was owned by the nobility. That is why poaching was such a common offense in the noble and serf era. Without the nobles' express permission, if you went out and hunted a deer, hunted a rabbit, even if it was just to feed your family, that was actually stealing from the nobility. And you know, that caused a lot of problems. A lot of people were like, I just want to feed my family, but that was not allowed under the Old English law. And so when America became colonized, the wildlife in America was still technically owned by the nobility in England. And so once the United States gained its independence, we can call it kind of like the frontier mentality. Wildlife was seen as a free-to-use exploitative resource, meaning if you could go out and if you could kill it, you could eat it, it was used. It was, you know, there were no rules, there were no regulations. And then after the frontier mentality days led to the days of, you could almost call them the dark days of American wildlife, because there were no rules and regulations and the wildlife was seen as free to use. It led to a lot of overexploitation, a lot of overhunting. Everyone's heard about the story about the carrier pigeon. The carrier pigeon went extinct. It was once the most numerous bird in North America, and yet it got hunted to extinction. The dodo bird is another example, a different example, but exploitation led to extinction. So after a while, and sorry, I got some notes here. That's why I'm gonna look at my computer every now and then. So after all the exploitation and the utilization of the wildlife and all the expansion of agriculture, railroads, and things like that, wildlife populations were absolutely crashing across the country. So the states began to pass laws and regulate hunting season to start protecting wildlife. And this was the time when the Lacey Act was actually implemented, which the Lacey Act was one of the first major federal acts to protect wildlife, and it was made illegal to transport illegally taken wildlife across state lines. It was one of the first federal instances to protect wildlife in North America. Now, wildlife in North America at the time, there was a whole bunch of back and forth on like what's legal, what's not legal, and things like that. So it started evolving and it started becoming a more conservationist mindset. But there's an important distinction to make that I want to make it very, very, very clear. The founding fathers in the early forms of government did not ever want the wildlife to go back to being owned by nobility, or in our case, owned by the government. So this is the common misconception that I want to make very, very clear, and a lot of people are confused. A lot of people in America believe that wildlife is owned by the state government. Some of them say it's owned by the federal government, but essentially they say wildlife is owned by the government. And it is expressly written in our, I don't remember if it's in the actual Constitution or, where exactly it is. But wildlife in North America is not owned by the government. It is owned by me and by you if you're an American citizen. It is owned by American citizens. And that's the important distinction to make. In North America, wildlife is not owned by the government. The wildlife is seen as a public trust, separate from the land. Yes, you can own land, but you do not own the wildlife. You don't own wildlife. The government doesn't own the wildlife either. The wildlife is in a public trust, meaning it's owned by all citizens. The states and the federal government are tasked with being regulators of the government. In fact, let me go to my note real quick, and because I wrote it down and perfect. Wildlife is owned collectively by the government, and the government at both state and federal levels act as the trustee responsible for managing and conserving wildlife on behalf of the public. So that is the very important distinction to make. The citizenship of the United States own the wildlife, and the government is held responsible for adopting regulations and protecting the wildlife for current and future generations. So that's why they have so much power and so much regulatory authority in the Endangered Species Act and things like that. Because this doesn't just apply to game animals. This applies to all wildlife, including plants. The government is tasked with the state and federal governments are tasked with managing and conserving natural resources for current and future generations. And now you can debate back and forth on whether the government's doing a good job, bad job. That's not what the discussion is. But I wanted to make it very clear because it's a common misconception. But the basis of all wildlife law in the United States, the basis of all laws, where it's adapting, is that the public owns the wildlife. Is it a public resource that the government is tasked with managing and conserving responsibly? Because think about it this way: if the government could come in, if it was under the old serf and nobility law, then the government could just say, you know what, we're no hunting whatsoever, no hunting at all, and it would make it illegal across the country. That completely goes against the founding fathers and what they wanted, and beyond all the rest of the political ramifications, it is actually illegal for the government to just do that for no viable reason. They have to have their reason. That is why so much money and effort goes into doing population estimates and population studies on especially game species, ones that are actively hunted, and why sometimes regulations change, and why the United States law is actually a very constantly evolving, I don't want to say that. Regulations are constantly evolving. They're constantly being looked at and changed very, very often. Sorry, my phone is getting low on battery, so I need to charge it. But that's a very important distinction to make. And it's why in the United States we have what are called public lands. And there are some in England as well, but it's not very many. And in fact, across the world, there's not very many nature reserves, public parks, national parks, and things like that. You have some, but not to the level that the United States does. The United States has a swath of land that is called public lands. Yellowstone National Park, Mount Rushmore, all the national parks. There's wildlife management areas and things like that. It's very, very important to keep that in mind. So whenever you are looking at a changing wildlife law or changing wildlife regulation, know that it's not the government just doing things sort of willy-nilly. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it, but it's important to note that everyone owns the wildlife. So we can debate on the ethics of hunting at a later date, but it's why attempts to squash all hunting comes down to a personal choice. The government can't just stop hunting, broad statement. It's because it is the right of every citizen to utilize that resource within the legal confines of their state government's decisions. And that's why a lot of states actually regulate. More regulations are done at the state level than the federal level. The federal level is really only looking at migratory birds and endangered species. States also look at endangered species, but states are only concerned within the confines of their jurisdictional boundary versus the federal government has to look at them as a whole. But please, it's really frustrating. And I don't mean this, sound frustrating. It's just, it's really, really, really important to remember that the natural resources of the United States are owned by the public. So it's up to the public to try and manage this resource as best as possible and hold your regulators accountable if you believe that they are not conserving the natural resources or that you don't agree with regulatory pressures and things like that. You are allowed to voice your opinion because you own that wildlife. They're the stewards that are tasked with trying to manage it. But if you want something changed, it's your right to do that because you own that wildlife. So do I. If you don't like hunting, well, I'm sorry. That is essentially the right given to us by our founding father, that people are allowed to hunt, especially on their own land, because they're utilizing the resource. Because you choose not to utilize the resource, that's your choice. But someone else can utilize that resource, and as long as they're following all the laws and regulations, why you can't just have them stopped, why hunting just can't stop. So I just wanted to do this. It wound up being a little longer, but it's a really important video because when you start thinking about all the laws and regulations that go into it, you have to remember the federal government doesn't own the wildlife. So every decision they have to make says we need to allow the public to utilize this resource, but still conserve it for future generations. But thank you guys so much again. I really appreciate it. Hope to see you again. Sorry for the second educational lecture video in a row. I promise you will have a fish video next week because I've already got it raring to go. I just got to change the intro, but it's still going to be a good one. But I really, really wanted to get this one off my chest because it's very important to me, and I'd like everyone to know that. But thank you guys so much again. Please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you do. I'd really appreciate it. Hope to see you again. If you'd like to support the channel, please click the link down below. It is by no means expected, but very much appreciated. Regardless, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and peace.